The distant wail of a coyote cut through the frigid dawn as Kieran Zabel stepped out of his cabin, pulling his worn leather coat tighter against the bitter Wyoming winter. His breath formed clouds in the air as he surveyed the snow-dusted landscape of his ranch outside Opal, the harsh December of 1878 testing even the hardiest of souls who called this untamed territory home. Kieran moved with purpose toward the stable, his boots crunching through the frost-covered ground. At 32, his face was weathered from years under the merciless western sun, his dark hair flecked with early silver at the temples despite his relatively young age. The life of a rancher was unforgiving, but it was the only one he'd ever wanted since settling here 7 years prior after the war had left him restless and unable to return to his family's home in Missouri. The morning ritual of feeding his horses was as natural to him as breathing. He slid open the heavy wooden door to the stable, the familiar scent of hay and horses greeting him like an old friend. The gentle nickering of his prized quarter horses, 12 in all, filled the cavernous space. But this morning, something felt different. His hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The horses seemed agitated, particularly his favorite mare, Penny, who pawed nervously at the ground. Kieran moved cautiously between the stalls, senses heightened, until a small movement in the corner of the stable caught his eye. In the shadows of the last stall, pressed against the wall behind his chestnut gelding, was a woman. Her clothes were tattered, her face dirt-streaked and gaunt with hunger. Wild, frightened eyes stared back at him from beneath a tangled mass of auburn hair. She couldn't have been more than 25, but hardship had clearly taken its toll. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Kieran said softly, holstering his weapon. "What's your name?" The woman remained silent, her body trembling visibly as she tried to make herself smaller against the wall. Nearby, he noticed a small sack containing what looked like a few withered apples likely taken from the barrel he kept for his horses. "You hungry?" he asked, taking a careful step back to give her space. "There's proper food in the house. You're welcome to it." She shook her head, eyes darting toward the door as if calculating whether she could escape past him. "I'm Kieran Zabel. This is my ranch," he gestured around him. "And you are," for a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "Grace." "Grace Morrow," Kieran nodded, careful to keep his movements slow. "Well, Miss Morrow, I can't in good conscience leave you out here in this cold. You look like you haven't eaten in days." He noticed how she flinched at his assessment. "Please come inside, no strings attached." "Just a meal and maybe a chance to warm up." Grace's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why would you help me?" "Because that's what decent folks do," he replied simply. "And around these parts, decent folks are harder to come by than gold nuggets." She didn't move, and Kieran sighed. "I'll make you a deal. I'm going to go back to the house and make some breakfast. I'll leave the door open. If you decide you want a hot meal, you know where to find me." He tipped his hat slightly. "The choice is yours, Miss Morrow." With that, he turned and walked away, hoping his gamble would pay off. Hospitality was currency in the West, and Kieran had always been richer than most in that regard. Inside his cabin, Kieran stoked the fire in the iron stove and began preparing a hearty breakfast: biscuits, bacon, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as his mind wandered to the woman in his stable. Where had she come from? What was she running from? The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the winter had been brutal. For her to have made it this far on foot spoke of either desperation or determination, perhaps both. After 20 minutes, he heard the creak of the door. Grace stood on the threshold, hugging herself against the cold, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "Come in before you freeze," Kieran said without turning from the stove. "There's water in that basin if you'd like to wash up. Food'll be ready in a minute." Grace closed the door behind her but remained standing near it, as if prepared to bolt at the first sign of danger. Only when Kieran placed a plate of food on the table and retreated to the other side of the room did she approach cautiously. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a seat but not touching the food. "It ain't poisoned," he said with a hint of a smile. "Would be a waste of good bacon." She met his eyes briefly before picking up a fork with trembling fingers. Once she took the first bite, her hunger won out over caution, and she began to eat with barely contained desperation. Kieran poured her a cup of coffee and set it within her reach before sitting down with his own plate. "I don't mean to pry," he said after giving her some time to eat, "but a woman alone in these parts is unusual, especially one hiding in my stable." Grace paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. "I didn't steal anything important, just an apple or two for the past couple of days." "I figured as much. My horses seemed mighty protective of you, especially Thunder, that chestnut you were hiding behind. He's usually not so friendly with strangers." She looked down at her plate. "I've always had a way with animals. They don't judge you for your circumstances." "Unlike people," Kieran finished for her. Grace nodded, a flash of pain crossing her features before she carefully composed herself. "I can work," she offered suddenly, "to repay you for the food and for not calling the sheriff." "Why would I call the sheriff over a few apples?" Kieran asked, genuinely puzzled. "Some men would," she replied, her voice hardening slightly. "Some men don't need much reason at all." Kieran sensed there was a story there, one she wasn't ready to tell. "Well, I ain't some men. And as for work, I won't turn down an extra pair of hands around here, but you look like you need rest more than anything else." Grace's jaw set stubbornly. "I don't accept charity." "Then consider it an advance on future work," Kieran countered smoothly. "There's a small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You're welcome to it for as long as you need." Her eyes widened slightly. "I can't stay here. I should move on as soon as possible." "To where?" "The next town is Evanston, and it's 15 miles through mountain passes." "In this weather, that's a death sentence for anyone, let alone someone in your condition." "You don't know anything about my condition," she snapped, then immediately looked contrite. "I'm sorry, that was ungrateful." Kieran waved away her apology. "You're right, I don't know you or your story. But I know what desperation looks like, and I know what it's like to have nowhere to go." He stood and carried his empty plate to the wash basin. "The offer stands. Stay until the weather breaks at least, then decide what you want to do next." Grace stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning in his words. "Why are you being kind to me?" Kieran thought about his answer carefully. "I've seen enough unkindness in this world to last several lifetimes," he said finally. "Maybe I'm just trying to balance the scales a little." She didn't respond, but he noticed her shoulders relaxing slightly as she finished her meal. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first few days were tense. Grace kept to herself, speaking only when necessary, her eyes constantly wary. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she insisted on earning her keep, taking on kitchen duties and helping with the mending tasks that wouldn't require her to leave the safety of the cabin. Kieran respected her boundaries, never pushing for information she wasn't ready to give. On the fourth morning, Kieran returned from tending the horses to find Grace kneading dough for bread. Her sleeves rolled up to reveal thin arms and purple-yellow bruises that were fading but still visible. She quickly pulled her sleeves down when she noticed his gaze, a flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Sorry," he murmured, turning away to give her privacy. "I should have knocked. It's your home," she replied softly. "You shouldn't have to knock to enter your own kitchen." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the rhythmic sound of dough being worked. "Those horses of yours," Grace said suddenly, clearly trying to change the subject. "They're beautiful animals, especially the black mare with the white star." "That's Starlight," Kieran said, grateful for the diversion. "She's got the sweetest temperament of the bunch. Do you ride?" "I used to," she admitted. "My father taught me when I was young, before." She trailed off, her hands stilling in the dough. "Before," Kieran prompted gently. Grace's face closed off again. "It was a long time ago," Kieran nodded, not pressing further. "Well, once this weather clears a bit, maybe you'd like to help me exercise them. They get restless in the winter when they can't run as much." "I'd like that," she said, a genuine smile briefly lighting her face before disappearing behind her usual guarded expression. That night, as a brutal storm raged outside, Kieran was awakened by sounds of distress coming from the small room where Grace slept. He approached cautiously, listening at the door to her whimpers and broken pleas. "No, please, I won't do it again, please don't." "A nightmare," Kieran debated whether to wake her or let it pass. His decision was made when he heard a cry of such raw fear that it sent chills down his spine. "Miss Morrow," he called through the door, knocking lightly. "Grace, wake up, you're dreaming." The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by ragged breathing. After a moment, her tremulous voice came through the door. "I'm sorry if I woke you. Don't apologize. Are you all right?" A pause. "Yes." "I'm fine, just a bad dream." Kieran rested his forehead against the doorframe, wishing he could do more. "If you need anything, I don't," she cut him off. Then softer, "But thank you, Mr. Zabel." "Kieran," he corrected gently. "Just Kieran is fine." Another pause. "Thank you, Kieran." "Good night." "Good night, Grace." As Kieran returned to his bed, he found himself wondering more about the mysteries surrounding Grace Morrow. The bruises, the nightmares, the constant fear, they painted a picture he'd seen before in women escaping violent husbands or worse. His jaw tightened at the thought. Whatever or whoever she was running from, he silently vowed she would be safe here. The storm lasted 3 days, trapping them in the cabin together. Gradually, Grace began to relax more in Kieran's presence, though she still kept much of herself guarded. They fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Kieran would handle the outdoor chores while Grace maintained the cabin, and in the evenings, they would share simple meals by the fire. On the second night of their confinement, Kieran pulled out a worn deck of cards. "Do you play poker?" he asked. Grace shook her head. "My father considered games of chance to be sinful." "Well, we're not playing for money, so I reckon we're safe from damnation," Kieran said with a smile. "I could teach you if you'd like." To his surprise, she agreed. As he explained the rules, dealing out practice hands, he noticed her quick mind and strategic thinking. By the third round, she was already catching on to his tells. "You touch your beard when you're bluffing," she said triumphantly as she laid down a winning hand. Kieran laughed, genuinely delighted by her observation. "No one's ever called me on that before. You've got sharp eyes, Miss Morrow." "Grace," she corrected, echoing his words from the night before. "Just Grace is fine." It was a small moment, but Kieran recognized it for the offering. It was a tiny sliver of trust in a world that had clearly taught her to trust no one. On the morning the storm finally broke, Kieran stepped outside to assess the damage. The snow had drifted high against the cabin walls, and several fence posts had been damaged, but overall, his property had weathered the tempest well. The bright winter sun transformed the landscape into a glittering expanse of white that nearly hurt the eyes. He was examining a section of fallen fence when he heard the stable door open. Grace emerged, wrapped in a shawl he'd lent her, her face turned up toward the sun like a flower seeking light. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked almost at peace. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he called to her. She startled slightly, not having noticed him, but nodded. "I've always loved the way the world looks after a storm, so clean and fresh, like everything bad has been washed away." "A chance to start anew," Kieran agreed, approaching slowly. "Speaking of which, I was thinking of riding into town today to get supplies. The road should be passable now." Grace's expression immediately shifted to alarm. "Town, Evanston," he clarified. "We're running low on flour and coffee, and I thought maybe I could pick up some fabric." "That dress you're wearing has seen better days." She looked down at her tattered garment, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I can't ask you to spend money on me." "You didn't ask, I offered." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you'd prefer to come with me and choose something yourself." The suggestion clearly terrified her. "No, I mean, I shouldn't. It's better if I stay here." Kieran nodded, not pushing the issue. "Is there anything special you'd like, a particular color perhaps?" Grace seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had ever asked her preference before. "I've always been fond of blue," she admitted softly. "Like the sky on a clear summer day." "Blue it is then," Kieran said with a smile. "I'll be back before dark. There's stew left from last night if you get hungry, and I'll be fine," she assured him, then hesitated before adding, "Be careful." Something in her voice, concern for his welfare, warmed him unexpectedly. "Always am," he promised. The trip to Evanston took longer than usual with the snow-covered roads, but by mid-afternoon, Kieran had completed his errands. In addition to the necessities, he'd purchased several yards of sky-blue cotton fabric, a small sewing kit, and on impulse, a silver hairbrush with a simple flower design on the back. It was perhaps too forward a gift, but something in him wanted to see Grace smile again. As he was loading his purchases onto his wagon, a voice called out to him from across the street. "Zabel, haven't seen you in town for weeks." Kieran turned to see Sheriff Tom Harrington approaching, his badge gleaming against his dark coat. "Been busy at the ranch," Kieran replied, shaking the lawman's hand. "That last storm kept me homebound for days." "Same for most folks," the sheriff agreed. "Say, have you seen any strangers around your property lately? I've got a telegram here about a woman who might be passing through." "Husband's looking for her, says she ran off after a disagreement." Kieran's heart rate quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Can't say that I have. What's she look like?" Sheriff Harrington pulled out a piece of paper. "Young, mid-20s, auburn hair, green eyes." "Name's Grace Mitchell. No, wait, Morrow. Grace Morrow." Kieran's grip on his wagon tightened imperceptibly. "Doesn't ring any bells. What's she wanted for?" "Nothing criminal, according to her husband. Just a domestic dispute. Says she's not well in the head, prone to flights of fancy and such. He's worried about her safety traveling alone." The sheriff tucked the paper away. "If you see her, send word. Husband's name is Victor Morrow, some big shot from Denver, offering a reward for information." "I'll keep an eye out," Kieran promised, fighting to keep his voice even. "But with this weather, I doubt anyone's making it too far on foot." "True enough." The sheriff glanced at Kieran's purchases. "Buying fabric, don't tell me you've taken up sewing in your old age," he joked. Kieran forced a laugh. "Just some material for curtains. That east window lets in too much morning light." After a few more minutes of casual conversation, Kieran bid the sheriff goodbye and headed back to his ranch, his mind racing. Grace's husband was looking for her and offering a reward. The bruises, the fear in her eyes whenever someone mentioned town, her reluctance to give her full story, it all made terrible sense now. The sun was beginning to set by the time Kieran returned home. As he approached the cabin, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows, creating a warm and inviting tableau against the snowy landscape. It struck him then how much the place had changed in just a week, with Grace's presence from a mere shelter to something closer to a home. Grace met him at the door, relief evident in her face. "I was starting to worry," she admitted, helping him carry in his purchases. "The days are short this time of year. Got held up talking to folks in town," Kieran said, carefully watching her reaction. "People get chatty when they've been snowed in." She nodded distractedly, already examining the supplies he'd brought. When she came across the blue fabric, she stopped, running her fingers over it reverently. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thought you might be able to make something new for yourself," Kieran said. "And there's this too." He handed her the small package containing the silver hairbrush. Grace unwrapped it with tentative fingers, her eyes widening as she revealed the gift. I can't accept this," she stammered, though she made no move to return it. "Course you can," Kieran insisted gently. "It's just a small thing." She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly glistening with unshed tears. "No one's given me a gift in a very long time." The simple statement, delivered with such raw honesty, struck Kieran like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Grace surprised him by stepping forward and quickly embracing him, a fleeting touch that was over almost as soon as it began. "Thank you," she said, pulling back immediately, a blush spreading across her cheeks. "You're welcome," Kieran replied, feeling strangely off balance from the brief contact. They worked together to put away the supplies, an awkward tension now hanging between them that hadn't been there before. Kieran knew he needed to tell her about his encounter with the sheriff, but he dreaded seeing the fear return to her eyes. Finally, as they sat down to a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Kieran cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something, Grace. I ran into Sheriff Harrington in town today." The spoon she was holding clattered against her plate. Did he ask about me?" Kieran nodded grimly. "He had a telegram. Your husband is looking for you, offering a reward for information." All color drained from Grace's face. "Victor," she whispered, the name itself seeming to cause her pain. "Did you tell him I was here?" "No," Kieran assured her quickly. "But Grace, I think it's time you told me what you're running from. If I'm harboring you, I deserve to know the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, then set down her spoon with a trembling hand. You'll make me leave once you know. Try me, Kieran challenged softly. Grace took a deep, shuddering breath. I married Victor Morrow 3 years ago. He was charming, wealthy, respected in Denver society. My father had just died, leaving me with nothing but debts. Victor seemed like salvation. Her bitter laugh held no humor. For the first few months, he was everything I could have wanted in a husband. Then he changed. Kieran remained silent, allowing her to continue at her own pace. The first time he hit me, he wept afterwards, swore it would never happen again. I believed him. She shook her head at her own naivete. The second time, he said I had provoked him. By the fifth time, he didn't bother with excuses anymore. Her fingers unconsciously traced the fading bruises on her arms. I tried to leave twice before. The first time, he found me at my cousin's home in Colorado Springs. The second time, I made it as far as Cheyenne before his men caught up with me. That time, his punishment was. She swallowed hard. More severe. Kieran's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he kept his voice even. How did you get away this time? He was away on business. I took what little money I could find, some food, and ran. I've been traveling for nearly 3 weeks, mostly on foot, hiding during the day, moving at night. I was trying to reach California, figured I could lose myself in San Francisco. She gave a mirthless smile. I didn't count on Wyoming winters. And you ended up in my stable, Kieran finished for her. Grace nodded. I was planning to steal one of your horses, she admitted, but I couldn't bring myself to do it, and then the storm hit, and I was too weak to travel anyway. Her eyes met his, fear and defiance warring in their depths. So now you know, I'm a runaway wife legally, still my husband's property. Helping me could be considered a crime. Kieran considered her words carefully. The law's not always right, he said finally. And no man has the right to beat his wife, money and social standing be damned. Hope flickered briefly in Grace's eyes before doubt extinguished it. You don't understand. Victor is powerful. He has connections everywhere, judges, politicians, lawmen. If he finds me here, he won't just take me back. He'll destroy you too. Let him try, Kieran said with quiet determination. This is my land. Out here, a man's word and his gun still count for something. I won't let you risk yourself for me, Grace insisted. I should leave as soon as possible. And go where? In this weather with no money and a man like that hunting you? Kieran shook his head. No. You're staying right here until we figure something out. We, she echoed, sounding both hopeful and confused. Yes, we, Kieran confirmed. You're not alone in this anymore, Grace. For the first time since he'd found her, Grace allowed herself to truly cry, not the silent tears of resignation he'd glimpsed before, but deep, body-racking sobs of relief and fear and emotions too complex to name. Kieran moved to her side of the table and awkwardly placed an arm around her shoulders, offering what comfort he could. You're safe here, he murmured. I promise. As her tears subsided, she looked up at him with reddened eyes. Why are you doing this for me? You barely know me. Kieran thought about his answer carefully. Maybe that's true, but I know enough. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you're kind to animals and make the best cornbread I've ever tasted. This drew a watery smile from her. And I know that no one deserves to live in fear. He didn't add what else he knew, that in just a week, this woman had somehow become important to him in ways he wasn't ready to examine too closely. The following weeks brought an uneasy peace to the ranch. Grace gradually shared more of her story, how she'd grown up the daughter of a teacher in St. Louis, how her father's gambling debts had left her destitute after his death, how Victor had seemed like the answer to her prayers until the mask of civility had slipped to reveal the monster beneath. In return, Kieran told her about his own past, his time fighting in the war, the family land in Missouri he'd left behind, his journey west seeking something he couldn't quite name. They developed an easy companionship, working side by side during the days and talking by the fire in the evenings. True to his word, Kieran began teaching Grace to ride again, starting with the gentlest of his horses, Starlight. At first, she was tentative, years of fear and submission making her doubt herself. But as the days passed, her natural affinity for horses reasserted itself, and soon she was riding confidently around the corral he'd built. You're a natural, Kieran told her one crisp January afternoon as she guided Starlight through a series of turns. That mare's never taken to anyone like she has to you. Grace's cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, her eyes bright with a joy he'd never seen before. "I'd forgotten how much I loved this," she admitted, patting the horse's sleek neck. "The freedom of it." "Freedom suits you," Kieran said, the words coming out more tenderly than he'd intended. Their eyes met across the corral, something unspoken passing between them. Then Grace looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I should help with dinner," she murmured, dismounting gracefully. As she led Starlight back to the stable, Kieran watched her go, aware that his feelings for Grace had grown far beyond simple charity or even friendship. The realization both thrilled and troubled him. She was still legally married, still healing from deep wounds both physical and emotional. The last thing she needed was another man complicating her life. That evening, as they ate the venison stew Grace had prepared, Kieran brought up a subject he'd been considering for days. "I've been thinking," he began cautiously. "The sheriff mentioned your husband was from Denver." "That's a fair distance from here, but not far enough for real safety." Grace tensed. "What are you suggesting?" "I have a friend in California, San Francisco, actually, owns a shipping business. Good man, trustworthy." Kieran hesitated, then continued. "I could write to him, see if he could help you get settled there, maybe find work." He watched her face carefully, noting the flash of disappointment before she masked it with a pragmatic nod. "That's very thoughtful of you. I'd be grateful for the introduction." "It would take time to arrange," Kieran added quickly. "Several weeks at least, no need to rush into anything." Grace studied him across the table. "Do you want me to leave, Kieran?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "No," he answered honestly, "but what I want doesn't matter." "Your safety does. And you think I'd be safer away from here?" Kieran sighed. "I think as long as you're in Wyoming territory, you're too close to Denver. Your husband sounds like the type who doesn't give up easily." "He isn't," Grace confirmed, her voice hardening. "He's obsessive, possessive. In his mind, I belong to him and he'll never stop looking." Her hands tightened around her cup. "But I'm tired of running, Kieran, tired of living in fear." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." She took a deep breath. "I'm saying maybe it's time I stopped hiding and stood my ground." Kieran leaned forward, surprised by her resolve. "That's a dangerous position to take against a man like Victor Morrow. More dangerous than slowly dying inside, more dangerous than giving up any chance at happiness." She shook her head firmly. "I ran because I had no choice, no allies, no strength left. But now," her eyes met his steady and clear, "now I have a choice." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Kieran knew he should discourage her, should insist that safety lay in distance, in anonymity. But something in her newfound determination sparked an answering resolve in him. "If you stay," he said slowly, "we need to be prepared. He'll come eventually or send men to come for you. I know. And legally, the odds are stacked against you. He's your husband." Grace's expression hardened. "The law gave him the right to marry me, not to torture me." Kieran nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "There might be a way, it won't be easy, and it'll require proof." "Proof," Grace echoed, "of his abuse. Testimonies, perhaps from servants or neighbors who witnessed it. Medical records, if they exist. Anything that would convince a judge that your life was in danger." Kieran ran a hand through his hair. "I know a lawyer in Evanston, discreet man, specializes in difficult cases. He might be willing to help." Hope flickered across Grace's face. "Do you really think it's possible? A divorce?" "It's rare, but not unheard of, especially in cases of extreme cruelty." He reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, covered her hand with his own. "It won't be quick or easy, but if this is what you want, I'll stand with you." The touch of his hand on hers seemed to startle them both. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Grace turned her palm upward, her fingers entwining with his in a gesture of trust that spoke volumes. "Thank you," she whispered. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Kieran was acutely aware of the softness of her hand in his, of the way the lamplight caught in her auburn hair, of how far she'd come from the terrified woman he'd found hiding in his stable. Reluctantly, he withdrew his hand. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, speak with the lawyer." Grace nodded, a new determination settling over her features. "And I'll start writing down everything I can remember, dates, witnesses, incidents. If I'm going to fight, I need to be thorough." That night, Kieran lay awake long into the small hours, his mind turning over possibilities and dangers. The path Grace had chosen was fraught with risk, but he admired her courage. More than admired it, he was falling in love with her. The realization should have troubled him more than it did. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as inevitable as the changing seasons. But loving her and acting on that love were two different matters. Grace needed an ally now, not a suitor. And Kieran was determined to be whatever she needed him to be, even if that meant keeping his growing feelings to himself. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Kieran prepared for his ride into town, checking his sidearm and rifle, a precaution that wasn't lost on Grace. "Do you think there's danger?" she asked as she packed him a small bundle of food for the journey. "Probably not," Kieran reassured her. "But I've lived long enough to know it's better to be prepared." He hesitated before mounting his horse. "Bar the door while I'm gone, and there's a shotgun in the cabinet by the fireplace. Do you know how to use it?" Grace nodded grimly. "My father taught me. I'm not a bad shot." "Good. I'll be back before dark." He swung into the saddle, then added, "Grace, be careful." "You too," she replied softly. The ride into Evanston was uneventful, the winter landscape peaceful under a cloudless sky. In town, Kieran made straight for the small office of Judah Parker, the attorney he'd mentioned to Grace. Parker was a bookish man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a reputation for taking on cases other lawyers wouldn't touch, divorce on grounds of cruelty. Parker said after Kieran had explained the situation, careful to omit any names for now. "Difficult but not impossible. The courts in Wyoming territory are more progressive than most in these matters." "What kind of proof would be needed?" Kieran asked. Parker ticked off points on his fingers. "Witness testimonies, medical evidence, pattern of behavior, character references for the wife." He peered at Kieran over his spectacles. "And it would help immeasurably if the husband has a reputation for violence or erratic behavior outside the home." Kieran leaned forward. "And if such evidence could be gathered, then we might have a case." Parker set down his pen. "But Zabel, you should know this kind of proceeding is ugly. Intimate details dragged into public view, and if the husband is as powerful as you suggest, he'll fight dirty." "She's prepared for that," Kieran said, hoping it was true. Parker studied him for a long moment. "This woman, she's important to you, isn't she?" Kieran didn't bother denying it. "Yes." "Then a word of caution, friend to friend, until she's legally free, keep your distance." Any hint of impropriety could destroy her case. The warning stung, but Kieran knew it was sound advice. "I understand. Good, now when can I meet this client of yours?" "She's staying at my ranch currently for her safety." Parker's eyebrows rose. "Already you're giving her husband's lawyers ammunition, but what's done is done. Bring her in when you can discreetly." As Kieran prepared to leave, Parker added, "One more thing. You mentioned the husband is from Denver. What's his name? I'd like to make some discreet inquiries." Kieran hesitated only briefly. "Victor Morrow." Recognition flashed in Parker's eyes. "The railroad investor, owns half the mining operations in Colorado. You know of him, by reputation only." Parker's expression grew grave, "and it's not a favorable one. Rumors of bribery, intimidation, connections to some unsavory characters, nothing proven, of course." "That could work in our favor," Kieran suggested. "Perhaps, or it could mean he has the resources to make problems disappear." Parker didn't need to elaborate on what or who might be included in those problems. With a promise to return with Grace as soon as it was safe to do so, Kieran left the lawyer's office. He completed his remaining errands quickly, eager to return to the ranch before darkness fell. As he was mounting his horse outside the general store, a voice called out to him. "Mr. Zabel." Kieran turned to see Molly Evans, the young woman who worked at the town's small telegraph office, hurrying toward him. "Miss Evans," he acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "Something wrong." "Not wrong exactly," she said, slightly breathless from her run. "But I thought you should know. There was a telegram asking about you yesterday." Kieran's hand stilled on the reins. "About me?" Molly nodded. "From Denver. Someone asking if you had any female visitors or new workers at your ranch, specifically mentioned a young woman with auburn hair." A cold weight settled in Kieran's stomach. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing," Molly assured him. It seemed odd, and I don't gossip about the private business of good customers. She lowered her voice. But Mr. Zabel, the telegram was signed by someone important, a Mr. Victor Morrow, said he was a business associate of yours. He's no associate of mine, Kieran said grimly. Thank you for telling me, Miss Evans. I appreciate your discretion. Of course. I just thought you should be warned. The message had an uncomfortable tone to it. Kieran thanked her again and set off for home at a faster pace than he'd planned, unease growing with every mile. If Morrow was already making inquiries in Evanston, it meant he had somehow tracked Grace's movements this far. But how? And how much did he know? The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Kieran crested the final hill before his property. From this vantage point, he could see the whole of his small ranch spread out below the cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, the stable, the corral, the fields now dormant under snow, and the 3 riders approaching from the east. Kieran's blood ran cold. Even at this distance, he could tell they weren't locals, their clothes too fine, their horses too sleek for working ranchers. He urged his horse into a gallop, taking a roundabout route that would bring him to the back of his property unseen by the approaching men. Grace was in the stable when he arrived, brushing Starlight with long, smooth strokes. She looked up with a smile that quickly faded when she saw his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, immediately alert, riders coming, 3 of them from the east. Kieran was already moving, checking his rifle. "Could be nothing, but it's him," Grace said, her face draining of color, "or his men." "We don't know that for certain," Kieran cautioned, though he felt the same certainty in his gut, "but we need to be ready. Come on." They hurried to the cabin, where Kieran quickly barred the door and began loading the shotgun he'd mentioned earlier. "Take this," he told Grace, handing her the weapon. "Stay in the back room. If things go badly, there's a window there big enough for you to climb through. Starlight is the fastest horse. Head west into the hills if you need to run." Grace took the shotgun with steady hands, her earlier panic replaced by a calm resolve that impressed him. "And what will you do? Talk to them first, see what they want. And if it's me they want." Kieran's jaw set in a hard line. "Then they'll be disappointed." The sound of approaching hoofbeats ended their conversation. Grace squeezed his arm once before retreating to the back room as instructed, taking her position beside the window where she could both escape if necessary and provide covering fire if needed. Kieran moved to the front window, peering cautiously through the curtains. The 3 riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. 2 were clearly hired muscle big men with hard faces and visible sidearms. The 3rd was slighter, more elegantly dressed in a tailored coat and derby hat. Even without seeing his face clearly, Kieran knew instinctively that this was Victor Morrow. Taking a deep breath, Kieran stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but visibly in his arms. "Something I can help you gentlemen with," he called out. The well-dressed man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Are you Kieran Zabel?" he asked, his voice cultured but with an underlying coldness that set Kieran's teeth on edge. "I am, and you are Victor Morrow." The man didn't bother dismounting, a deliberate discourtesy in the West, where proper introductions were typically made on equal footing. "I believe you have something of mine, Mr. Zabel." Kieran kept his expression neutral. "Can't say that I do, Mr. Morrow." "Don't believe we've ever had business together." "Oh, but we do now." Morrow's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My wife, Grace, has gone missing. I have reason to believe she's here." "Your information is mistaken," Kieran replied evenly. "I live alone." One of Morrow's men snickered, a sound that raised the hair on the back of Kieran's neck. "Perhaps you misunderstood me," Morrow continued, his voice hardening. "I'm not asking, I know she's here." He gestured dismissively around the property. "This homestead, it's quite isolated. Perfect place to hide a runaway wife, or to take advantage of one." The implication in his tone made Kieran's grip tighten on his rifle. "I suggest you watch your next words very carefully, Mr. Morrow." "Or what?" Morrow laughed, a hollow sound devoid of humor. "You'll shoot me." "Over a woman who legally belongs to me. That would be murder, Mr. Zabel, but I'm a reasonable man. Return my wife and we'll forget this unfortunate misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Kieran insisted, "and there's no one here but me." Morrow sighed theatrically. I had hoped to resolve this amicably. He nodded to his men, who began to spread out, flanking the cabin. Search the property, he ordered them. Kieran raised his rifle. This is private land, you're trespassing. Am I? Morrow reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. I have here a warrant, signed by Judge Holloway of Denver, authorizing the search for and recovery of my wife, who has been declared mentally unsound and in need of medical confinement. The words hit Kieran like a physical blow. A legal warrant, one that would supersede any claim of trespassing. Grace isn't unsound, he said, abandoning the pretense. She's afraid, and with good reason. A triumphant smile spread across Morrow's face. So you do know her, how interesting. He tucked the paper away. Step aside, Mr. Zabel, or my men will be forced to move you. Inside the cabin, Grace listened to the exchange with growing horror. The warrant Morrow mentioned was undoubtedly false or obtained through bribery, but it would serve its purpose, giving his men legal cover to take her by force. And now Kieran was in danger because of her. She gripped the shotgun tightly, weighing her options. She could run, as Kieran had suggested, but that would mean leaving him to face Morrow's wrath alone. Or she could fight, but against 3 armed men, the odds were poor. There was a third option, one that turned her stomach but might be the only way to protect Kieran. She could surrender voluntarily, return to the hell she'd escaped, on the condition that Morrow leave Kieran unharmed. Before she could decide, the sound of a scuffle outside spurred her to the window. One of Morrow's men had dismounted and was approaching the cabin, hand on his pistol. Kieran stood his ground, rifle raised. Last warning, Kieran called out. Turn around and leave my property. The man didn't slow his approach. Or what, rancher? You gonna shoot me for executing a legal warrant? The tension was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Grace knew that if shots were fired, Kieran would be outnumbered and likely killed, and she would be taken anyway. She couldn't let that happen. Making her decision, she moved to the front door of the cabin. Taking a deep breath, she lifted the bar and stepped onto the porch. Stop, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. There's no need for violence. All eyes turned to her. Kieran's face registered shock and dismay. Grace, get back inside, he ordered urgently, but Grace's attention was fixed on Victor, who sat on his horse with an expression of calculated satisfaction. Hello, Victor, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Grace, my dear. Victor's tone was honey over steel. You've led us on quite a chase. It's time to come home now. I'm not going anywhere with you, Grace replied, still holding the shotgun at her side. Not ever again. Victor's pleasant facade slipped momentarily, revealing the rage beneath. You have no choice. You're my wife. A wife you beat and terrorized, Grace shot back. I'd rather die than return to that life. The standoff continued, the air thick with tension. Kieran had moved to stand beside Grace, his rifle trained on Morrow's approaching henchman, who had stopped his advance but kept his hand near his pistol. You're embarrassing yourself, Grace, Victor said coldly, making wild accusations, hiding with some common rancher. What would your father think? My father would be horrified by what you did to me, Grace replied, her voice unwavering. By the bruises you left, by the fear you instilled, by the life you stole from me. Victor's eyes narrowed dangerously. Enough of this spectacle. Thomas, Jenkins, bring her here, and if the rancher interferes, shoot him. The 2 men moved forward simultaneously. Without hesitation, Kieran fired a warning shot into the ground at their feet, causing them to halt. Next one won't miss, he promised grimly. For a moment, no one moved. Then Victor gave an almost imperceptible nod to his men, and both drew their pistols with practiced speed. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. One of Morrow's men fired first, the bullet splintering the porch railing inches from Kieran. Kieran returned fire, his shot finding its mark in the man's shoulder. The second man took aim at Kieran, but before he could pull the trigger, the roar of Grace's shotgun filled the air. The blast didn't hit the gunman directly but was close enough to startle him, throwing off his aim. In the chaos that followed, Victor Morrow drew his own concealed pistol, a small derringer, and aimed it directly at Grace. If I can't have you, no one will, he snarled, his refined facade completely dropped. Kieran saw the movement and threw himself toward Grace, knocking her aside as Morrow fired. The bullet grazed Kieran's arm instead of finding its intended target. The injured gunman was down, clutching his bleeding shoulder and cursing. The second had taken cover behind a water trough, exchanging shots with Kieran, who had positioned himself in front of Grace. "Run," he shouted to her during a brief lull in the gunfire. "Take Starlight and go," but Grace stood her ground, reloading the shotgun with shaking hands. "I'm not leaving you," she insisted. Across the yard, Victor Morrow was retreating toward the cover of the trees, his cowardice evident now that the situation had turned violent. His remaining man provided covering fire as Morrow fled. "He's getting away," Grace cried, a mixture of relief and frustration in her voice. "Let him," Kieran replied, taking careful aim at the second gunman. "You're what matters." The gunfight continued for several more tense minutes, a standoff that might have ended badly if not for an unexpected intervention. The distant sound of galloping horses drew everyone's attention. 3 riders appeared on the ridge: Sheriff Harrington and 2 deputies, drawn by the sound of gunfire. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff bellowed as they approached. "All of you right now." The remaining gunman hesitated, then seeing he was now hopelessly outnumbered, tossed his pistol aside in surrender. In the aftermath, as Sheriff Harrington sorted through the conflicting stories, the truth gradually emerged. The warrant Victor Morrow had brandished proved to be a forgery, expertly crafted but ultimately illegal. The injured gunman, faced with the prospect of a long jail sentence, quickly turned on his employer, confirming that they had been hired to retrieve Grace by any means necessary. "He told us she was crazy, that she'd tried to kill him in his sleep," the man admitted sullenly as the deputy bandaged his wounded shoulder. "Said it would be a kindness to bring her back for treatment." "And you believed him?" Sheriff Harrington asked skeptically. The man shrugged. "He paid well, didn't seem like our business to question it." As for Victor Morrow himself, he had vanished into the wilderness, though the sheriff promised to send telegrams to neighboring counties to be on the lookout for him. "He won't get far," Harrington assured Grace and Kieran. "Man like that, dressed like that, he'll stick out like a sore thumb in these parts." Once the sheriff and his deputies had departed, taking the captured gunman with them, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Kieran winced as Grace cleaned and bandaged the graze on his arm, her touch gentle but her expression troubled. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "This is all my fault." "None of it is your fault," Kieran countered firmly. "The only one to blame is Victor." Grace finished securing the bandage, her fingers lingering on his arm. "You could have been killed today because of me." "I made my own choice," Kieran reminded her, "and I'd make it again." Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the unspoken feelings between them seemed to crystallize. Kieran reached up tentatively, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. "We should get some rest," Kieran said reluctantly, pulling his hand away. "It's been a long day," Grace nodded, though neither made any move to separate. "Kieran," she began hesitantly. "What happens now?" It was a question with many layers, and Kieran answered the most pressing one first. "We continue with the legal route. Parker thinks we have a case for divorce, especially with what happened today. The sheriff's testimony about the forged warrant will help. And Victor," he's shown his true colors now, "attempted murder in front of witnesses, even a man with his connections can't easily escape that." Grace nodded, taking comfort in the practical plan. "And us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kieran's heart raced at the question. "That depends on what you want," he said carefully. "Parker advised me that until you're legally free we should keep our distance, for the sake of your case." "I see," Grace replied, disappointment evident in her voice despite her attempt to hide it. "But," Kieran continued, taking her hands in his, "I want you to know that whatever happens, however long it takes, I'll be here, because—" He took a deep breath. "Because somewhere between finding you in my stable and today, I fell in love with you, Grace Morrow." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. For a moment, Kieran feared he had overstepped, had put too much on her shoulders when she was already carrying such a heavy burden. Then Grace smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you offered me breakfast instead of calling the sheriff," she admitted. when you treated me like a person deserving of kindness, not a possession or a burden." Kieran wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms to seal their confession with a kiss, but he restrained himself, honoring the boundaries they both knew were necessary for now. "We'll take it one day at a time," he promised instead. "And when you're ready, when you're free, we'll have all the time in the world." Grace squeezed his hands, her eyes shining with a hope he hadn't seen before. "One day at a time," she agreed. The following months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, testimony, and waiting. True to Sheriff Harrington's prediction, Victor Morrow was apprehended trying to book passage on a train to Denver. The charges against him were substantial: forgery, attempted kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. His money and connections, which had always protected him before, couldn't shield him from the weight of evidence and eyewitness accounts. In a surprising turn of events, once word of Victor's arrest spread, other women came forward, servants from his household, a previous fiancé who had mysteriously broken off their engagement, even the widow of a business partner who suspected Victor of orchestrating her husband's accidental death. The pattern of violence and manipulation extended far beyond his marriage to Grace. Through it all, Kieran remained steadfast at Grace's side, accompanying her to court appearances, standing as a character witness, offering silent support when the questioning became particularly brutal. They maintained a careful distance in public, their relationship strictly proper, though the private glances they exchanged told a different story. Finally, on a bright spring day in May 1879, Judge William Thompson of the Wyoming Territorial Court granted Grace's petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. Furthermore, in a decision that sent shockwaves through Denver society, he awarded her a substantial settlement from Victor's estate as compensation for her suffering. The court finds that Mr. Morrow's treatment of his wife was not merely cruel but barbaric, the judge stated firmly. No contract, including marriage, should bind a person to endure such treatment. As they left the courthouse, Grace clutched the divorce decree in trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "I'm free." Kieran, walking beside her, resisted the urge to take her in his arms there on the courthouse steps. "Yes," he agreed simply. "You are." They rode back to the ranch in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The world seemed different, somehow brighter, full of possibilities that had seemed impossible just months before. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, Kieran reined his horse to a stop. Grace halted beside him, giving him a questioning look. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been even when facing down armed gunmen. "But I wanted to wait until you were truly free to answer." Grace's expression softened with understanding. "I'm listening." Kieran dismounted and helped her down from her horse. Standing before her, he took both her hands in his. "I know it might seem too soon after everything you've been through, and if it is, I understand. I'll wait as long as you need." "Kieran," Grace said gently, "ask me." He took a deep breath. "I love you, Grace. I think I started falling for you that first morning when you had the courage to step into my cabin despite your fear. I love your strength, your kindness, your determination. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life showing you what a true partnership can be." He squeezed her hands. "Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." This time, Kieran didn't hold back. He gathered her in his arms and kissed her tenderly at first, then with a passion that had been building for months. Grace responded in kind, her arms winding around his neck, her body melting against his. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. "I promise," he said softly, "that you will never know fear in our home, that you will always be respected and cherished." "I know," Grace replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "That's why I love you." They married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Evanston, with Sheriff Harrington and Judah Parker as witnesses. Grace wore a dress of sky blue silk, a gift from Kieran, and carried a bouquet of wild prairie flowers. Kieran, in his best suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him, finally free, finally his. Their life together unfolded like the Wyoming landscape, sometimes harsh, always beautiful in its own way. With Grace's settlement money and Kieran's knowledge of horses, they expanded the ranch, breeding and training quarter horses that soon gained a reputation throughout the territory. Grace, with her natural affinity for the animals, proved to be as skilled a trainer as Kieran, and together they built something neither could have achieved alone. In the spring of 1880, Grace gave birth to their first child, a son they named Michael, after Kieran's father. 2 years later came a daughter, Emma, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's steady temperament. By 1888, their family had grown to include twin boys, Joseph and William, who kept the entire household on its toes with their adventures. Through it all, Kieran and Grace never forgot how their story began with a desperate woman hiding in a stable, starving but too afraid to ask for help, and the man who offered kindness without condition. Their love, born in the harshest of winters, bloomed eternal like the wildflowers that covered the Wyoming hills, each spring resilient, beautiful, and free. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Kieran surprised Grace with a special gift, a silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children. As he fastened it around her neck, he whispered, "No regrets." Grace turned in his arms, her face soft in the firelight, the years having added character rather than taken away her beauty. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. From the stable came the soft nickering of horses, including old Starlight, now retired to a life of leisure, and her numerous offspring. The sound mingled with the distant laughter of their children, already in bed but clearly not yet asleep. "I'd say we found each other exactly when we were supposed to," Kieran mused, drawing her close. Grace nodded, resting her head against his chest. "I think you're right. Some stories are just meant to be." Outside, snow began to fall softly, blanketing their ranch in pristine white, nature's way of reminding them how their journey together had begun. But inside, the hearth burned warm and bright, a fitting symbol for the love that had transformed two wounded souls into something stronger than either could have imagined alone. And in that moment, as in countless moments before and countless yet to come, they were simply and completely home.